Hey guys, we're going to be talking about population interactions today, and just so you know, I think the folder on School Fusion for this is called Ecosystem Interactions, but it's the same thing, population interactions, ecosystem interactions. I know they're a little different, but I just mislabeled them as ecosystem interactions on School Fusion. So anyways, let's go ahead and get started. First thing to talk about are niches and habitats, and you can pronounce this various ways, niche, niche, whatever, but the American way is the niche, so we'll call it that. So just make sure you know the difference between a habitat and a niche. Habitat is like the address, the place where the organism actually lives. And then the niche, you could say, are all of the various roles that an organism fulfills. Um, so, yeah, it's just an organism's role in the environment, all of its little jobs that it does. I have a really cool video, but when I imported this from my PowerPoint into this ActiveInspire, the link to it went away. So I think I'm just going to have to show it to you in class when I see you next. But it does a really good job explaining what a niche actually is, because it's kind of difficult to explain. And it gives us some good examples of these terms we're getting ready to talk about. So there's two different types of niches. You have a fundamental niche and a realized niche. Fundamental niche is full range of resources and habitat that the organism can use if you don't have any competition, which is pretty much make-believe because we can assume that pretty much any species, any population is going to have competition. And that's what this says up here. Fundamental niche is just, all the resources an organism has access to if they don't have any competition, which, as we said, is highly unlikely. Realized niche is the range of resources and the habitat that they can use when they have competition there, present. And again, so that's going to be more realistic. So this is pretty easy to remember. You hear realized niche, think more realistic, okay, because you're going to have competition. And a pretty good example of this are these lizards called anoles. Now, actually, I like red better. Let me underline. So you have these native, and when we talk about native, we talk about the species that is supposed to be living there. They're endemic to the area. They are native. They belong there. So you have down in the southeast, you have the Carolina anoles, you have the Florida anoles, and they do reside mostly in Florida. What happened is that you have some invasive anoles from Cuba, and they are brown. And by the way, these native ones are, we're going to call them green. And that's actually what color they are. The green ones have been there. We have these invasive brown ones introduced from Cuba. And these brown ones are really good competitors, as we're going to see a lot of invasive species are. So they're really good competitors, they're really good survivors, they're doing a lot better than the green guys. So they end up taking over a lot of the green guys' niche. And in fact, local people there thought that the green anoles had, their populations were decreasing. They thought they were dying out in huge numbers. But it turns out a lot of the green guys are still there. They've just been pushed to kind of extremes of their habitat. They've found them living in vegetation and wetlands. They found them living up really high in trees. They've kind of been pushed to the exterior areas of their niche. So they're still there. They've just been, their niche has been compromised. So we would say their fundamental niche is all the areas that they used to occupy before the Cuban brown anoles got there. And now their realized niche are all these extremities of the environment that they now have to live in due to the competition of the brown anoles. Okay, so like I said, we'll watch the video and it will kind of help to explain that. The guy in the video explains it in terms of lichens. Okay, some other terms you need to know are generalist versus specialist. And again, they're pretty much just like what they sound like. A generalist species is going to be one that can eat and live in a wide variety of habitats, a wide variety of foods. They're really good survivors. We'd call them kind of hardy, weedy species because they do well in lots of different types of environments. So rabbits, again, you see them all over our neighborhoods. They can live in really harsh human infested environments. Same thing with raccoons. We see them all around. They're really good survivors. Roaches would be a good example. Dandelions and other weedy type plants would be generalists. They live in lots of different types of environments. A specialist is going to be a type of species that can only occupy a very narrow type of niche. They have to have a really specialized type of habitat or a really specialized type of food source. So a good example of this would be koalas, because they only eat eucalyptus leaves off of eucalyptus trees. And in fact, when we talk about endangered species here in our next chapter, we're going to learn that a lot of endangered animals also happen to be specialists because they have to live in a specialized type environment. And if that one specialized type environment or that one special type of food source is not available, they're in some trouble. Okay, law of competitive exclusion is going to go back a little bit to that niche stuff we were just talking about. But what it says is that no two species can occupy the same niche at the same time. Okay, it is impossible for two different species, to occupy the same niche at the same time because one would have to outcompete the other. Okay, so that's what this says, is one would end up having to migrate, die, or they'd undergo what's called resource partitioning, which I'll explain in a second. Okay, so it's impossible for two species to share the same niche at the same time. The only exception to that is if they do resource partitioning. And resource partitioning is when two different species can use, or two or more species, can use the same resource in a slightly different way or at a different time to allow both species to use that same resource. Okay, some examples of that would be lots of different species of birds using different branches of a tree or different areas of a tree. Or lots of different species of lots of different organisms using the different layers in a forest. And if we go to this next page, actually let's look at the resource partitioning. Okay, so this is resource partitioning. You see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 species of bird that all like to use the same sort of tree in the same forest. They've all found different areas of the tree. They're going to offer them different habitats, probably different food sources, different places to nest, which are all different parts of their niche. So all 5 of these species have been able to find a way to coexist by partitioning that resource, okay, using different parts of it. Okay. And then another good example, I was getting ready to talk about coyotes and wolves, which that video clip will talk about. So I'll save that for the video clip in class. But coyotes and wolves, they reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone Park, where the coyotes had kind of taken over while they were gone. When they reintroduced them, the wolves are really outcompeting the coyotes. So it's said that they've actually been able to resource partition a little bit, where they've been able to hunt during different times of the day. Okay, so even timing could be a form of resource partitioning. All right, this is the textbook example of the law of competitive exclusion, and we're going to use 2 different species of paramecium. Paramecium are these little furry-looking one-celled things, little protists. They have the little cilia, little hair-like projections around them. So they took 2 species of paramecium, P. aurelia and P. caudatum. When you grow each of these species alone in a petri dish, so here's the growth curve of P. aurelia when it's grown in a little petri dish by itself, it does just fine. It accelerates, it reaches its carrying capacity, and it levels off. When you grow P. caudatum in a petri dish by itself, again, it does just fine. It's able to grow and slow down and level off. However, when you grow both of them together in the same dish, we see P. caudatum doesn't do so hot. It starts going, and then P. aurelia outcompetes it. P. aurelia continues to thrive, and P. caudatum actually dies out. Okay, so they both tried to share the same niche in the same petri dish. They were both trying to live in the same environment, eat the same foods, and one outcompeted the other. So that's the law of competitive exclusion. Okay, competition. So we kind of already know what competition is. When 2 or more organisms in the same community are going to seek the same resource, such as light, food, water, nesting space, ground space, which is in a limited supply. So it could be any part of the environment. There's two different types of competition that you guys need to know about. You need to know about intraspecific and interspecific. Intraspecific is going to be between members of the same species. So you could say that would be stuff like territoriality, even mating. Members of the same species are competing over the same resources. Again, whether it be the area that they're competing over. Sorry, this is taking me so long to type, to write. Or maybe they're competing over females. So again, intraspecific would be within the same species. Interspecific is going to be between different species. So maybe they're fighting over food sources, water, and any other resources that many species would fight over. Okay, so between different species. There's competition. Predation, one species is going to be preying on the other one and it's going to consume it in the process. A really good example here are lions preying on wildebeest. And that's actually a female lion doing the hunting, which is how it goes in the wild. Females actually do the hunting and the killing. And the males just get to come by and eat whatever the females killed for them. Anyways, predators rely on lots of adaptations that help them to catch the prey, like sense of smell, speed, stealthiness. And then prey have also then evolved some counter mechanisms to help them avoid being preyed upon, like camouflage, noxious taste, spines, thorns, and speed to also get away from the predator. And we'll probably be looking at some predator-prey growth curves because oftentimes predator and prey growth curves kind of follow each other, where the prey will grow and then the predator will follow it, and then when the prey decreases, the predator also decreases. So a lot of times they end up taking on these little cyclical growth curves. Mimicry. Mimicry is a type of camouflage where organisms evolve to mimic other living things like vegetation, larger animals, or sometimes even some scary looking eyes. So I'll show you some examples of those. There's a couple different types of mimicry, and to be honest with you, I like to talk about this in biology, but for this course, it's not so important, but I'll just introduce them real quick. So Batesian mimicry is when organisms mimic another one that's undesirable or threatening to predators, where the one that does the mimicking actually isn't threatening to predators, but it mimics ones that are. So the best example of that are viceroy butterflies that actually taste pretty good. They mimic the monarch butterfly, which tastes really bad. They look almost identical, and I'll go to the next slide to show you. Okay, so viceroy actually tastes pretty good. Monarch tastes really bad. They both look very similar to each other, and this one is just mimicking the bad tasting one. So he wins out. Monarch actually doesn't necessarily lose, but you've got some guys that are still tasting pretty good. Now, Malarian is kind of the one that's better for everybody, because here a whole bunch of different threatening species all evolved to resemble each other, so they kind of spread the word to the predators, don't eat any of us, we all taste bad, we're all toxic, whatever. I don't have any pictures of these, but an example would be social wasps, solitary digger wasps, and caterpillars of the cinnabar moths. They all look very similar. They all taste bad, toxic, whatever. So if a predator happens to eat any one of them, the message is spread, don't eat anything that looks like that. So here are those butterflies we just looked at. Here are some caterpillars, and hopefully you can kind of tell them the mimicry that they are trying to portray. They actually are trying to look like snakes with large, scary eyes. So you have your scary eyes up here. Their antenna can actually inflate to look like a tongue sticking out at the front here. So those are pretty cool. And here you have a lot of cool mimicry with praying mantises. This one has actually evolved to mimic a dead leaf. Okay, herbivory is just the act of herbivores eating plants or producers. Symbiosis, a symbiotic relationship, is just any relationship between two organisms. These can be very close and intimate. Sometimes the organism's actually living on or inside of the other one. There's three main types that we're going to explore today. Those are mutualism, parasitism, and commensalism. So we'll start with mutualism, and mutualism is one where both species benefit. So I've always tell my biology students, just think they mutually love each other, they mutually respect each other, because everybody wins in this situation. They both help each other out, and so everybody benefits. Really good example of this, and we'll look at lichens here in a second. Lichens are a really good example of that. Another really good example of mutualism are insects and the flowers that they pollinate. The insects benefit because they get the nectar from the flowers, and the flowers benefit because that's how a flower is able to sexually reproduce. When insects pick up the pollen from a flower and they go to another flower, and that will fertilize the next flower. So again, it's a win-win. They both win out of this situation using our 7 habits language. So lichens here, it tells us that lichens are actually a relationship between fungus and algae. The fungi provide the framework and the moisture and sites for attachment, while the algae carry out photosynthesis and provide nutrients to both itself and the fungus. Now, if you don't know what a lichen is, as soon as I show you a picture, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. There are these crusty little things that you see on tree bark and out on rocks in the woods. There's a lot of different types of lichens, but it's actually 2 organisms living together. It's fungus and algae living together, and they both help each other out. Okay, actually, I wanted to answer this question. What other mutualistic relationships can you think of? Some of the ones that I wrote down, a lot of kids remember from younger grades, is possibly that the oxpecker bird that rides around on the backs of organisms out in the savannah in Africa. You see them on rhinos and that sort of thing. As long as both members are benefiting, it'd be mutualism. So if the bird is getting a free meal from cleaning the organism, because that's what the relationship is, the bird is eating bugs off of the larger organism, and then the larger organism is getting a free cleaning from the bird, and it's also protecting the bird. As long as they're both benefiting, then that would be mutualism. If one isn't benefiting, then that would actually be the next one that we're going to talk about, which is commensalism. Same thing with the cleaner fish. That's kind of a classic example. You've got that little cleaner fish stuck to a shark. If the cleaner fish is getting food from the shark, and then also protection from the shark, and then the shark is getting a free cleaning, as long as they're both benefiting, that would be mutualism. Okay, parasitism is the bad one. This is where the parasite can live on or inside of the body of another organism and get nutrients from it. It says it may be a temporary one, as in the case of ticks or fleas, or it may be more permanent, as in the case of tapeworms. And it's asking you for other examples here. Okay, so here you have a tapeworm. We can talk more about parasites in class if you guys want to, but there's all sorts of nasty parasitic worms. You don't really run the risk of getting tapeworms in our country. There is one type of parasitic worm that quite a few kids living in the States get, and that's pinworms. And you'd get that from playing in contaminated soil. And they're little tiny white worms that live down at the end of your digestive tract. And they come out of your digestive tract, so you know where that is, at night, and they lay eggs. And it gets very itchy, and little kids scratch, and then they touch other kids, and it can spread through daycares and that sort of thing. So that's a parasite because it lives in your large intestine. Ticks are a big parasite that you can catch around here. We're having a large incidence of Lyme disease from tick bites in this area, so that's something we have to be careful for. And then this is a type of fungus. It's actually called a parasitoid, where this happens to quite a few different types of insect species, where if the insect ingests or breathes in the spores, then the fungus actually eats them from the inside out, and they die. So a lot of human type parasites, they don't kill you, or sometimes they don't want to kill you because you're their host and they want to keep you alive. But these types of parasites almost always kill the insect that they prey on. Okay, commensalism is a weird relationship. It's where one benefits and the other is not affected. So one gets something out of it, the other one could really care less. It doesn't help or hurt them. So a really good example of this are orchids. What happens with orchids, they are epiphytes, which means that they are plants that have to grow on another plant, and they're going to grow high up on the plant. And that's how they benefit from this. So they grow up high in the canopy of a rainforest, and they just use that tree to get height. And the height that they get from the tree that they're on is going to get them more sunlight, it's going to get them more rain, it's going to get them more animals to come and pollinate them. So they get a lot of benefits from being high up in the tree, but it says the orchids do not harm the tree that they grow on. The roots stay on the bark of the tree. They don't actually dig into the tree and take water and nutrients from it. If the plant did steal nutrients and water from the tree, then it would actually be considered a parasite and not commensalism. Okay, another example of commensalism would be barnacles on a whale. Barnacles are little crustaceans. They attach to a whale. They do not take any nutrients from the whale. All they do is they're latching on to catch a free ride because the whale moves and barnacles are filter feeders, so they need a constant movement of water across them so they can eat. But they do not eat. They do not eat off of the whale. They do not hurt the whale. The whale doesn't benefit. He is not hurt. He doesn't. He could care less. So it's commensalism. Okay, and yeah, I don't think I have any other examples of that one right now. Let's move on to, yeah, so you got your orchids and your barnacles. Okay, keystone species, this one's a little bit weird. These are species whose relative abundance may not reflect its importance to the ecosystem. So basically, it's really, really, really important, but you may not realize it, and it may not be demonstrated by its abundance. You might not see a whole lot of them, and you may not actually realize the importance, but if they were to disappear from the ecosystem, it would have cascading effects, and it would affect many other species in the ecosystem. So sometimes this is top predators, like a tiger. Here's another good example would be a gopher tortoise. And it says they're what we would call an ecosystem engineer because they build and they do really important stuff for the ecosystem that affects a lot of others. So what they do is they dig tunnels in the sand that lots of other species use for various reasons. For shelter, for protection, for laying their eggs, what have you, but a lot of species use these tunnels that the tortoises dig. Snakes, foxes, owls, armadillos, frogs, insects, they all use them. They're very important to the community, and if removed, they would interfere with the survival of all these other species. Another example similar to that would be beavers, with them damming up the water. If beavers, again, you don't think of a beaver being all that important to the ecosystem, because of the damming of the waters and because of all the other species who depend on these dams, if they were to have a large die-out, it would really affect a lot of the other species. Alligators do a similar thing in terms of engineering the environment. And I had one other one. No, I didn't. I didn't have another engineer. Okay, but I do have a lot of other keystone examples. Some other predators would be a sea star. Sea star, and it's going to take me a while to write that. Sea star. They're big-time predators, kind of like how I have the tiger listed there. And what the sea star does is they are major predators of mussels. And mussels are really good competitors. So when sea star populations have been decreased, it's caused for mussel populations to really skyrocket, and these mussels outcompete a lot of the other aquatic things. So it upsets the whole ecosystem. And then another really good predator is actually sea otters. So I'll just put that down here. And sea otters, what they eat a lot of are sea urchins. And sea urchins, when their population gets too large, they really damage kelp forest, which is kind of like a seaweed. So by sea otters being in good numbers, they eat a lot of sea urchins, which helps to keep the kelp forest maintained, which a lot of other species rely on. So those are kind of good examples of predators. What else? We have mycorrhizal fungi, which is a fungi that attaches to plant roots, and they really, really help with plant growth. They're crucial to the root system of plants. They help with plant growth. They're considered a keystone species. And then one other example I have it's a particular type of bat species. It's called the flying fox. They are a really important pollinator, and the reason they're a really important pollinator is for a lot of tropical plants, it's the only animal that will come along and pollinate those particular types of plants. So when you affect this bat species, the flying fox, you have a lot of tropical plants that will not be pollinated, and therefore the tropical plant populations will decrease. Okay, so you got lots of weird examples of keystone species there. And the last thing I'm going to end with are what we call exotic or invasive species, species that are not native to an area, but they have been introduced by humans. You guys are going to read a whole article about them, because one of the most important ones you need to know, especially for AP, are these guys. the zebra mussels. They cause lots of problems out in the Great Lakes. They're pretty nasty, and they are invasive. They are not native to here. They are not endemic to here. They have been moved here. Now, one of the things that make these things so dangerous is that they are really good competitors. So once they're introduced, a lot of times they can outcompete the native or endemic species that live here. They're really good at this because a lot of them lack predators. So once they're introduced here, they just really have a population boom and they can do a lot of damage to the ecosystem. So besides the environmental damage, they can be very expensive to try to get rid of, to try to eradicate. A lot of times they're found in areas that have tropical climates, and especially areas of high tourism where you see a lot of human traffic. Okay, so zebra mussels you guys will read about. Fire ants, I'll show you a picture on the next page. Water hyacinth is a plant. Stink bugs, they are invasive. We see those around here a lot. Okay, so there's your zebra mussels. Here's fire ants, and here's your stink bugs. They are invasive from Asia, and they've already seen a whole lot of issues with crops being destroyed by these guys. Okay, and they're just a recently invaded species. And that's all I have for you today. Like I said, hopefully we'll watch the video next class, and you guys are going to read more about invasive species as well.